So could Warhammer 40K be getting its own mini version of alternating activations? Let's talk about an interesting rules mechanic that I think has a fairly high likelihood of appearing in the next edition of the game. Hello and welcome back to Warsbet's Tactics, where today we're talking a little bit of 40k game design, and in particular whether or not this interesting reactions mechanic might be coming to 40k and basically allowing you to activate certain units in your opponent's turn for a few key actions. For those of you who have been around for a while, 40k edition releases do seem to follow a bit of a pattern these days. Games Workshop basically gets to work on them as soon as they've released the previous one, noting a bunch of things that they think could improve or shake up, any good ideas for new and fun mechanics, and certainly over the last few years do actually listen to community feedback these days, and they're well aware of some of the more common gripes with the game, though it doesn't always necessarily mean that they're going to change anything. In general, I'd argue that the 9th edition core rules are some of the best that 40k's ever had. It's basically 8th edition with a whole load of the weird oddities and things that didn't work ironed out, though perhaps the main issues with the core rules kind of pale into insignificance if you release vastly unbalanced individual faction rules. If they could manage to actually get the codexes right, then I think that we'd be playing a far better game. In any case, Games Workshop operates on a fairly established release cycle for 40k editions now. Ever since the launch of 8th edition, they basically seem to redo every single faction's codex, then likely release a new codex Space Marines, maybe add some new and interesting factions to the game, and it seems that the last year or so of the edition is often taken up by a campaign of some sort, the fall of Cadia and the return of Rabute Gilliman at the end of 8th, or the Psychic Awakening one in 9th that seem to culminate in the release of those new Necrons. As the edition unfolds, Games Workshop will absolutely be getting to work on 10th edition as everything else progresses, and I think their main challenge is to make the game mechanics feel new and more interesting, without ruining all the things that people already enjoy about playing Warhammer 40k. They gave us a community survey a few months back, where basically they were asking for feedback on certain specific actions of the game, and often whenever the community is polled about this sort of thing, one thing that almost always gets brought up is the I go you go nature of 40k, where basically you have one person play out their entire turn, leaving the other person to sit and watch for really quite a long time potentially. It can just be a bit boring for the other player, and giving one player an entire turn to act with everything in their army first does have the potential to create a bit of first turn advantage, though where credit's due to them, at least in 9th edition, that generally doesn't seem to be anywhere near as big of an issue as it has been in previous games, provided you are playing with a decent amount of line of sight blocking terrain on the table. In any case, perhaps one of the most obvious ways that you could change things up would be move to an alternating activations model. In 40k, I think most people would typically assume that that would be on a per unit basis. Most likely each player takes a unit that they get to move, shoot and assault with, though I guess you could do things like taking it in turns to move units, then shoot units, then assault. I think there's a few different ways that you could implement it, and it could still work. On paper it does really sound quite enticing, potentially like you're constantly reacting to the changing opponent's movements, and you'd have to think about each move that they make as they make it. Though I can't help but think that from Games Workshop's point of view, it's a bit of a risk really. You can say what you like about 40k's game design, but it's certainly stood the test of time. The format has easily carried 40k to be Games Workshop's most popular game for basically decades now, so I definitely see why Games Workshop could be kind of reluctant to change what seems to be an already very winning formula. So that brings us to these interesting new rules from the Horus Heresy. I touched on them in another video, but they basically seem to amount to making the non-player turns a lot more interesting with a few different things that they can do, while still keeping the game's basic format the same, so perhaps a few of the positives of alternating activations without having to go all in on the gamble. Basically, if this reactions mechanic does wind up being a popular and fun part of the Horus Heresy game, then I absolutely bet that it will appear in 10th edition in some form, adapted for the 8th and 9th edition rule set. The concept really does seem quite simple. In your army, each phase one unit can make a certain reaction. There's ones for the movement phase, shooting phase, and the charge phase. Each of those has a couple of different moves that you can do to hopefully counter the enemy's moves as they're making them. According to this, there's a few different rules that allow your army to make multiple reactions in a phase. Maybe certain army commanders, or maybe the battle size. Maybe you might get more if you're playing a really big game than a small one perhaps. And there are a few things that can stop your units reacting like normal, say being locked in combat, pinned down, or having to fall back. It's kind of interesting to see these realised for the Horus Heresy rule set, which is basically built off 7th edition. Some of it doesn't translate amazingly into 8th edition rules, but a lot of it seems like it could almost be a direct port over. In terms of what reactions we actually had, it appears that there's a table of core reactions here. I guess it's not impossible that there could be some army specific ones coming out as well. In the movement phase, you basically either get the option of moving towards the enemy or backpedaling away from them. If an enemy unit ends its move within 12 inches of your unit, you get to move them either directly closer or further away based on your initiative characteristic, which of course doesn't exist in 9th edition. Though I guess they could just give it a flat value or something like 3-inch movement, that could still be very powerful in the right circumstances. In particular, looks like it could be a good way of helping prevent charges. In the shooting phase, one unit in your army gets to react after being shot by an enemy one. They get to either return fire, so make a direct shooting attack back at the unit that shot them, or to try and evade the enemy's bullets. I'll admit I'm a little bit unfamiliar with the 7th edition rule set at this point, but to me that sounds like it's a damage mitigation roll, which sounds like it would be equivalent to a feel no pain type save in 9th edition. So basically in your shooting phase, you can have one unit fire directly back at the enemy, or have one unit be extra resistant to damage as they take cover. The return fire one though just seems absolutely super powerful really. It means it could be a very risky proposition indeed to shoot anything that's particularly big and strong. Getting a free shooting phase out of an entire massive unit seems like it could potentially be a bit unbalanced unless there's something to keep that in check. Finally, in the charge phase, you get to make a reaction after the opponent's made a charge roll, regardless of whether or not it's successful, and you get to declare that your unit's either going to overwatch or hold the line. Overwatch appears to be at full ballistic skill here, unless I'm missing anything, though I don't see why it couldn't just translate to hitting on 6s in 40k 9th perhaps. Hold the line maybe doesn't translate quite as well into 40k. It counts your enemy unit as having made a disordered charge, which I believe will be no more +1 attack if they're charging in. I guess maybe you could translate it as to not having them counted as charged or something in 9th, so they could potentially be struck first. Overall, it looks really quite interesting, I think, sort of a halfway house between some mini alternating activations and what appears to be a kind of alternative to certain stratagems, just having these as baked in rules and maybe something that you might not need to pay for command points anymore if it was translated to 40k. I think it'd make your own player turn a bit more nuanced. You'd have to consider the possibility that your opponent's units could be moving around or returning fire with quite powerful effect, and I feel like it might incentivize some really big units to take maximal advantage of these, as similar with stratagems, if you've got a really big unit that can take the advantage of the whole ability, you're going to get a bit more power out of it, say if you're getting to fire with a massive 20-man unit of marines against something that just shot them. Just as an initial impression, a few of these do seem really quite punishing to assault armies. If your enemy units get to backpedal and make your charges longer, that could be really annoying. Getting extra shooting out of return fire could be really powerful, and neither Overwatch nor Hold the Line are particularly handy for people charging in. Though just because one rule doesn't necessarily favour assault armies doesn't mean that they'd necessarily be weak in this. They could just have their points a bit cheaper than the shooting units if this rule didn't exist. Overall, I think it's really quite interesting stuff. So overall, my guess is that if this proves popular, they'll probably implement it in some way at least in Warhammer 40k 10th, maybe another example of a thing that they test out in a different edition for a different game, before drawing it back into a core edition. Do you think that that hunch is accurate? And if something like this was realised for Warhammer 40k, would you think it would improve the game? As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to keep these coming so often. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. I do try and give Patreon several decent rewards, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.